And there you go.
Hey,
There you go. Can you hear me okay, Dr. Helms? Good to see you again.
good to see you too, Daniel. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you just fine. I don't know what happened in the first try, but there it is now.
Got here eventually. Instagram didn't screw us.
Not for now.
Not yet. Yeah, they might.
So how you been? It's always a huge pleasure to talk to you.
Two-way street, man. I've been good. No, I've just been pretty busy, but I've been good. We just a couple months ago we got out of a long lockdown that we had, and now all my students are like synced up because they had multiple months they couldn't go to the labs. Now they're all collecting data at the same time, so it's just been kind of hectic, but it's exciting. It's cool to see everybody able to get back to the whole reason they came out to New Zealand to work with me in the first place. So no, I'm good. I'm good.
Sure, it's pretty awesome. I saw you recently in the Five-Star Congress on the very same topic of RIR.
Yeah, man, that was it was a fun presentation. I was really glad I got to go after James Krieger too, because he had a lot of really complimentary things to discuss that I think set the stage for me to discuss like the quote unquote intensity side of it after he discussed volume. So it was really well done. It was an honor to be a part of it.
And he actually implied that you were Batman. I don't know if you saw that part of the presentation.
I mean,
I'm
I tell you
the
what,
one.
like he used a science-based, logical inference to get there. I didn't know I was Batman before, but as someone who's ever in the space, now I believe that I am. So it really kind of changes my whole self-view.
If you were busy before, man, I can imagine now.
Yeah, when do I get to leverage Alfred? Like I haven't had a personal butler. I need this. Yeah.
I think we all do. So anyway, the topic at hand, RAR, RPE, and hypertrophy training. First of all, thanks again, man. It's always a pleasure. This is the third time we get to talk, so I truly enjoy it.
No, it's a pleasure.
Learn a lot. I hope the people joining us can also learn a lot. I wanted to begin by talking about the origins of the RPE scale, which, if I understand correctly, it's not in resistance training, but in endurance training. The original Borg scale that goes from 1 to 10 to 20. Actually, can we begin little by then, and then talk about your own? I think it was PhD research, right? That you
Yep.
validated the RP scale with the velocity loss training. Can we
Yeah,
go?
I was part of that. Yeah, absolutely.
Cool, man.
So if we take a trip down research memory lane, this actually started with a what's called the Borg scale, which is certainly an Americanized pronunciation of a Nordic last name. It's probably like the Berg scale, but I can't pronounce it. So back in 1970, the first time this scale was published, which is now 52 years ago, believe it or not. That doesn't make you feel old. That means you were born more recently than that. Uh, and it was a 6 to 20 scale, which if you're used to the more modern RPE scales, your initial response will be like, that's weird. Why would you be like, hey, how hard was that on a 6 to 20 scale? But the reason being was, like you said, it was primarily used as a proxy for heart rate. So if you think about resting heart rate being at roughly 60 and maximal being around 200, it was used for like incremental exercise tests to ask people while they had objective data on their like how difficult the exercise was to then get the subjective feedback. So it was their perception of the challenge of what they were doing and the amount of effort they were putting forth. And that research continued for, well, it still is continuing, to be honest. And there have been many adaptations of the Borg scale. In the 80s, they simplified it because, not everyone's heart rate, resting heart rate 60, not everyone's maximum is 200. You get older, it goes down, individual differences. So they adapted it to what's called the category ratio scale, which is a 0 to 10 scale. And that became what is more commonly used. And then that was basically validated. Both scales have been validated over the years, showing that they have a linear relationship with things like lactate and like metabolic exertion, like the total work. So it's how hard it feels does have some kind of basis in reality when you're talking about kind of global exercise. And then in the late 90s, early 2000s, they developed into what's called the session RPE scale. So prior to that, people had used the Borg scale maybe after each set or after a given exercise. and they would average it across the whole, the whole session. And then what they started to do was just do any kind of session, endurance, resistance, what have you, sports specific. And then after it, somewhere between like the 10 to 30 minute mark, which seems to be an important amount of time you need to wait so that the recency effect of the last thing you did in the session doesn't bias your perception. But you give that same 0 to 10 rating of the whole session. And that has been subsequently used in other calculations, like if we want to get an idea of internal load, quote unquote. External load might be something like volume load, or an endurance athlete, total amount of miles that you ran. And you could also look at the intensity of heart rate zones. But internal load is you can take the time spent in exercise and then multiply it by that session RPE, and that tends to track with external load. And when it doesn't, it tells you that perhaps the person is experiencing more fatigue than you'd expect just by the programmed exercise metrics. And that might be an influence of under recovery that has something to do with sleep, nutrition, psychology, what have you. So anyway, that's kind of where we were in like 2010, 2011, 2012. Outside of the research, while this was happening, and I've kind of recapped, 40 years, there's a gentleman by the name of Mike Tuchscherer, who is at the time, one of the best American powerlifters in the 120 weight class, and also one of the first and youngest kind of coaches who were kind of going against the grain of the way things operated. And he started to use a modified version of the Borg 0 to 10 RPE scale in resistance training, specifically where instead of having the descriptors for what each one of these are, because the way this happened in the lab is a researcher shows you a piece of paper, and it's 0 to 10, and 10 is maximal effort, 5 is like hard, 7 is very hard, and it has all these different subjective descriptors of what kind of difficulty you're perceiving. And he got rid of those and said, okay, 10 is the maximal effort, but on a scale below it, you understood that was in reference to that set and how close to failure you were. So a 9 RPE meant you could only do 1 more rep, an 8 RPE meant you could only do 2 more reps, a 7 RPE, 3. And the original version had some also metrics related to, and the bar speed slows down. So it was very powerlifting specific. And he's modified that over time. But he started programming with this because, for one, it's very important in powerlifting for you to have a conception of how close to your maximum are you, because it's literally the sport of guessing, trying to get as close to possible without going over and missing a lift. It's like the price is right for lifting weights, right? If you can squat 200 kilos, but you put 202 on the bar and you miss, you're stuck with whatever your previous attempt was, right? So anyway, that's important. And then also, it's a useful way to individualize things.
Sorry to interrupt. Yeah, so it was actually Mike T in the reactive training system that started to use this, or Absolutely. Someone before?
He was the first one, 2008.
Oh, sure. Sorry, man. Just wanted to clarify my own data.
No, it's all good. I've obviously, you can tell I've told this story before, so I just kind of monologue. Anytime you want to interrupt or ask a question, feel free.
No. Don't worry, please, man.
So anyway, so this is happening. So basically from 2008 to say 2016, this is something that only appears, 2015, that only appears in the powerlifting world. But that's not to say that there aren't similar ideas occurring in the research. And a group out of Sydney University led by Dr. Hackett, Daniel Hackett and some of his colleagues, they started comparing the Borg RPE to repetitions to failure estimations. So simply asking someone in the middle of a set after one of their reps, like when they complete a rep on squats or they lock out on bench, how many more do you think you can do? They call it out and they keep going. So not reporting an RPE value, but just a raw repetitions in reserve, if you will, an RIR. So in 2012, they published a study on bodybuilders performing multiple sets to failure with bench press and squats. And they had them rate their Borg RPE, and they also had them rate how many repetitions in reserve they thought they had, and then they had them go to failure so they can compare their estimation versus their actual. And they found that these bodybuilders were really accurate in estimating how close to failure they were. I mean, these are trained bodybuilders, it's probably not surprising. They were within like 1 rep most of the time. And if they did multiple sets, obviously they got more accurate as they were informed by the prior set. They're a little more fatigued. They're going to be doing less reps per set. However, when they reported their Borg RPEs, they were between 8 to 9, which kind of shows the issue with and these are sets to failure. And this kind of shows the issue with using the original Borg RPE scale for resistance training, and maybe why Mike T was making it based on repetitions and reserve, because the concept doesn't work well. And Hackett is not the only one. There's also a study by Shimano, and there's also one other study, and I'm forgetting the lead author, where they would have people go to failure, but they would be reporting RPEs between like 7 to 9. And this might seem very counterintuitive if people think about it, but the descriptions are very subjective. And if you were to take someone and ask them, hey, what does maximal effort feel like? Well, that depends upon your training background, right? If you were to ask a U.S. Marine, they're going to think back to when they did the Crucible. If you were to ask a marathon runner, they're going to feel like, what does it look like? What did it feel like when I'm falling across the finish line after 24 miles, right?
Right, totally.
And having them do a set of 8 on bench press, I mean, yeah, I couldn't have done another rep, but it's just not maximal effort. It's not as hard as it could have been. But instead, with the Mike T approach, where you're actually anchoring the scale and the subjective ratings to how close to failure am I, now you know what that means. Oh, maximal effort means that I couldn't have done that many reps with a heavier load, and I couldn't have done one more rep. And then if that's what you're actually thinking of, now all of a sudden you start to see better relationships. And that is what Dr. Zerdos did and what I did with my PhD. So I was part of some research that came out of his lab where we had trained lifters do 1RM tests as well as do 70% of 1RM set to failure, and had them rate their RPEs and also track velocity. And as people know from velocity, the bar speed slows down as you get close to failure. So we kind of quote unquote validated the RPE scale by showing that as RPE went up, velocity is going down. So the closer people get to failure, the slower the bar speed is. And there's been a lot of subsequent work over the last 6 years now that have tried to quantify how accurate are people at gauging proximity to failure in different conditions. It's 70% of 1RM, 80% of 1RM, front squat, hex bar deadlift, squat, bench, powerlifters, bodybuilders, untrained individuals, on machine chest press, women, men, the whole 9 yards. So that is where we're at today, is basically going, oh, this is a useful tool. It's free. And the question is, how can we use it?
The velocity-based equipment, it's quite expensive, right?
Yeah, it's getting cheaper, as most things do with time. But even minimum cost, you're looking at maybe $400 to get a reliable velocity tracker. And a lot of the ones out there aren't that great, like the ones that are based on accelerometers rather than the tethered systems. They're not that great from my experience in the lab. So
the question would be, who do I need to pay when I use the RPE and the RIR scale? Does it go to you? Does it go to Mike? To which Mike? Is it Mike T? Is it Mike Zerdos?
Yeah, we basically have a collective patent. So each one of us takes a third. So if you're training and you rate the RPE, you do actually have to call our very real legal team in Delaware. And then 1/10 of your gains is supposed to go to us. So that's how we accept payments. I can take it, man. I can take it 1/10. I think it's worth it, man. So it's big RIR, big RPE, like big pharma. That's right. But up until this point, I think it's evident, it's research for strength training. What happens with hypertrophy? Because there are a little bit of criticisms that I think are anchored in the bodybuilding mentality. That why would I want to leave reps in the tank? Why would be the sense of it if I want to be a bodybuilder, if I want to train balls out, How can we transition from the application of RPE and RIR from strength training to hypertrophy training? Yeah, that's a great question. And, you get the same critique, but for different reasons in the research. So in the research community, some of the pushback we got on this is, hey, this is subjective. And the reason why we have our participants trained to failure is because then we know that everyone is actually at the same intensity level, considering we have data to suggest that one person might be able to do 8 reps at 80% of 1RM, one person might be able to do 12. At 70% of 1RM, one person might be able to do 10, another person 20 or 25. It's actually some of the things we've seen. So from the researcher hat, they go, this is terrible, don't use this. Listen, if I want to control for effort, I want to compare a 10RM to a 10RM, right? Sure. The problem with that is we have a ton of research on training to failure, and it's not even actually as consistent as we think it is, and it's not necessarily the best way to train. It is a method of controlling difficulty, And in the bodybuilding community, there are definitely voices that would advise that you need to be training to failure, but they're not the only voice. Like kind of the the forever debate is between, you know, the high intensity crew and then the volume crew, and never the tween shall meet. You can't have something that's like moderate volume and moderate intensity, because that might be, you know, too easy. Who cares if it's optimal? I just want to throw up or feel like I'm going to tear my muscle groups, right? I'm a bodybuilder, which is not about, you know, doing things right. It's about being hardcore.
It's a war, brother.
I'm a bodybuilder. That's right.
Right, man.
So, so anyway, we have issues on both sides of this debate, and in the research, I think it's much easier to approach in that there's actually not consistency in the way failure is applied. You will see half the studies when they do quote unquote failure, it's what's called voluntary failure.
Right.
So that means the participant stops when they think they've reached failure, or perhaps there's some combination of the researchers and the participant going, okay, you can stop there, that was failure. And that's going to be, you know, accurate depending on the people. And let's say you are perfectly accurate. Like each time you stop when you couldn't have done another rep at the equivalent of a 10 RPE. That's quite different from the other half of the studies that are done with what's called momentary muscular failure, which means that you actually have to do the rep that you fail on, and that is objectively confirming that I have hit failure. So, you know, you do that rep, it's a 10 RPE, you think, no, I couldn't do another one. All right, try the next one. You get it halfway up, can't do it, you failed. And that's probably the most objective way to ensure that failure was achieved. And but the problem is that we have these studies and meta-analyses that are comparing non-failure groups to these failure groups, when failure is actually defined in multiple different ways, or sometimes is not defined well at all, and we don't know what the groups did. So we don't have a great idea of what's better than what, because we don't have consistent comparisons. And that's just on the failure side of that comparison. So you got all these studies. We have a failure group and a non-failure group. The thing is, since researchers have used failure as a way to standardize difficulty, what are they doing in the non-failure group? And is that standardized? And the answer is no, it's not. So typically what they're doing is they're matching the volume to the failure group by doing multiple submaximal sets that should be very submaximal for everyone, like multiple sets of 5 at 70%. The problem, though, is that for some people, a set of 5 at 70% leaves 5 repetitions in reserve, and for some people, it leaves 15. So there's variability on both sides. The people who are training to failure, if they're doing volitional, you're going to get some people at a 9 RPE, some people at they actually attempted a rep and failed it at 11 RPE, or they actually had momentary muscular failure. And this other group, you got anyone from between like a 5 to a 10 RIR. So it's a comparison that is dichotomizing something that is actually continuous. So what we've recommended in some of our recent methodological papers to the scientific community is that, look, we need to use consistent terminology. So if you want to have a failure group, you either need to actually have it be momentary muscular fatigue, or you need to do velocity profiling so you know what velocity is associated with the 10 RPE. And it's not perfectly reliable velocity at max, but it is much better. And if you were to take a group that was supposed to train to a 10 RPE, and you knew each individual's velocity for that movement when they were at a 10 RPE or a 0 RIR, meaning they couldn't do another rep, they would probably be within, they would be really close to failure or potentially accidentally failing, but it would be a much tighter distribution of what that failure group is, or that 10 RPE group is. And you can do the same thing with the submaximal group. Like, we want to have everyone train to a 7 RPE or a 3 RIR, and we have prior data where we went through a testing phase with this person, where we got the associated velocity for that movement when they're 3 reps from failure. And if we can do that, then we can actually start to get better comparisons. So that's the research side of it. We'll move that all out of the way, and we'll get back to your question, which is bodybuilders saying, hey, I'm never going to use RPE. I just need to train to failure. I'm trying to get that maximum muscle activation, bro. And that's a theoretically sound argument if you really narrow your view. Like if you and I were to go to the gym and someone asked, which one of these sessions is more effective for producing growth, and you trained to failure and did the same exercises and the same sets as I did, and I trained to a 7 RPE, the answer would be your workout. But that's a silly question, because we actually want to know, over time, after multiple months and years of training, what's going to produce the most hypertrophy. Not, if this is my last workout of all time ever, like, was this, who grew more today? You know, like that's not, that's like saying a marathon runner should run a marathon at the fastest pace they can every day
Right.
they train, right? Because
Very
they
true.
could have done a little more, you know? But obviously we know that that's not the best way to get better at running marathons in the long term. You have to vary the stimulus, you have to allow for recovery, etc. And the same thing is true of resistance training. If you want to train to failure and maximize the intensity side of the equation, you're going to have to reduce volume or reduce frequency. Because if we look at the data we know on what happens when you train to failure, we know that it creates a disproportionate amount of fatigue. So things like session RPE, blood lactate, indirect and direct indirect markers of muscle damage. So for example, creatine kinase, or the time course that it requires you to get your force production back up. So you see this dip in performance. It might last 48 hours if you train to failure with the same volume before it's back up versus say 24 hours if you did not train to failure. And of course, that's not a dichotomous thing. It's how close to failure did you get. So if we know that, you know, training to a 7 versus a 10 RPE might require a full extra day before you're fully recovered, does that therefore limit the total amount of volume or the total frequency you can use? And that may not be a concern for untrained or you know, moderately trained individuals or people who respond very well to lower volume programs. But for someone who maybe is more well trained and is taking or has found that they benefit from a higher volume, higher frequency approach, that might preclude them from using what might be optimal for them as an individual. So for
Yeah.
example, for myself, I've gone through multiple phases of training over time where I've experimented with lower or higher volumes or lower and higher intensities, proximities to failure. And I find that in my lower body, I can train with a much lower volume, which allows me to train closer to failure and get similar outcomes to if I train with a higher volume, but the higher volume just leaves me a little more fatigued. However, my upper body seems to respond much better to higher volumes. And if I train close to failure all the time, I can't achieve those volumes in a sufficient time course. It either delays my frequency or it just requires me to not be able to do as many exercises per session because they start to compound. Like, you know, if you go to failure on bench press and they do incline, the loads or the reps have to drop, and then you're going to do, you know, overhead press, etc. So right now, it's pretty clear that for some people and on average, moderate or higher volumes may be cyclically required or individually beneficial to break plateaus and increase hypertrophy. Volume is something that should be on the table. And we know that if we're using a very high intensity program, like if we're always training to momentary muscular failure, there's a reason why Dorian Yates, Mike Mentzer, and some of those approaches use very, very low volumes because they are limited by that high fatigue, high intensity approach. And if that is not best for everyone, or if you have tried to progress intensity, you're doing forced reps, you know, you're trying to, you know, do micro loading, all those things, and you cannot progress, it would be intelligent to be able to go, okay, I want to increase my volume or increase my frequency. And if you can't do that because you're limited by the fatigue you're producing, then you've kind of cornered yourself. So that means that we need to think about proximity to failure from a bodybuilding perspective, as far as how do we get the most out of this session without harming our ability to train effectively in the rest of the microcycle in subsequent days and then in the next mesocycle. So we probably want to have reasonably high RPEs, but we need to think about exercise selection. We need to think about the rep range, and we need to think about the frequency of training a given movement. And we also need to think about whether we're training at like long or short muscle lengths. Because if we're doing, you know, sets of 10 on lateral raises, I don't really care if you were to go to failure every single time. You know, like the hardest point is when you're in the shortened position. It's a small muscle. It's an isolation exercise, so there's not a lot of metabolic fatigue because you're not using many muscle groups. There's not going to be a whole lot of fatigue no matter what you do. So you go to failure, that's fine. You're not going to be that sore. You could probably do lateral raises 48 hours later with, you know, similar load and maybe even improve. But if you decide to do back squats, you know, for sets of 10 plus at a 10 RPE or actually in a momentary muscular failure, you may not be able to repeat that workout with the same level of load or number of sets or number of reps at that load for like 7 to 10 days, you know? So you just have to think about being strategic. Not how do I work the hardest I possibly can in this session, but how do I work the hardest I possibly can in this microcycle and mesocycle, and then long-term over time to ensure I'm still progressing.
Right. I wanted to touch on different subjects, but there's a question here by Scott Forbes. Hi, Dr. Forbes, Dr. Creatine. His comments always crack me up, man. Going to failure. Does concentric versus eccentric training, does failure differ between contraction types? I think it's a really interesting question.
Oh man, yeah. If you want to go to eccentric failure, you're going to be in a world of hurt. So just for those who don't know, just to be very clear, it's a great question. So concentric failure is what almost everyone thinks of when they think of failure, like I can't lift the weight. The eccentric phase, or I should say the eccentric action, is the lowering phase. So for example, on a squat, it is when you're actually squatting down into the hole. And what is occurring there is your muscles are lengthening while they're producing force. And the difference between the amount of force that you can produce eccentrically and concentrically, while there is some individual variation, is basically 20 to 40% higher. And that's why people don't fail on the eccentric phase. Like if you watch a powerlifting meet, people can lower the bar to their chest under control, they get the press command, they get a little bit off their chest, and they get stuck if they took too heavy of a load. The squat, the other movement in powerlifting that has an eccentric phase, they get in the hole, they come up, they get stuck, they grind, and then they fail. But let's say you had a powerlifting meet where it was the most you could eccentrically do. Like the heaviest weight you could control to your chest, that it wasn't just falling at the speed of gravity, or the heaviest weight on your back that you could squat into the hole under control and then you couldn't stand up with. You'd be seeing people who were benching 140 now benching 170, by quote unquote benching, meaning they get it to their chest under a little bit of control and then be stuck.
Sure.
So yeah, if you wanted to go to eccentric failure, we're talking about basically needing to get forced concentric reps, and then you stop at the point when you can no longer eccentrically control it. And that is going to be really fatiguing, and it'll create a ton of muscle damage, because we're basically now talking about doing additional eccentric reps, which are probably the source of the most amount of muscle damage. So you could expect to like double the recovery time courses. And when you control for load, you don't actually see, when you control for load and volume, you don't see enhanced hypertrophy from eccentric training alone. So anyway, you would have to go to concentric failure and then get maybe 3, 4, 5 more reps where you could then no longer control the weight. And that's like true, like high intensity training, old school Mike Menser stuff, where, you train like once every fortnight, so
I wouldn't want to try that, man.
It's brutal.
So the question I wanted to ask is, okay, and taking that question by Dr. Forbes into account, in our particular training for hypertrophy, how can we best standardize what is actually an RIR 0? Is it volitional, like I cannot do any more reps even if I tried, RIR 0, or maybe try the next rep, failing that rep, RIR 0, or do we move into the negatives, -1, like I used to train back in college? Man, I swear, everything was minus.
Yeah, I used to be training to negative RIRs when I started.
I'll feel you, man.
So the interesting thing is, like, a lot of people initially have like this knee-jerk negative reaction to rating RIR because it's subjective. I've actually talked to people who believe they're very scientifically minded, and they would either rather do percentage of 1RM or velocity-based training, but they'd never do RPE because it's subjective, so it might as well be useless. But the problem with that is that's not actually a very scientific argument. Just because something is subjective doesn't mean you can't measure it or quantify it. So the real question we need to be asking is, well, how accurate is RIR? How accurate are trained lifters at gauging this? Because we can measure that. We can have someone, like I said, in mid-set, estimate how many more they can do, and then be motivated until they actually go to failure. And you could say there might be some expectancy bias if they call something out, but I would put back that only can impact their physiology so much. And there was a great meta-analysis that was published last year by Halperin and colleagues, where they took all the various studies where they have quantified predicted versus actual RIR and pulled it together. And while there was a fair amount of heterogeneity, meaning that there's some variation between studies, the average error, meaning the estimated versus the actual RIR estimation, was 0.95 reps. So that means people are off by 1 on average. And if we include, some of that heterogeneity. You could say some people are super accurate. Most of the time they're on point, not a rep off, and some people are maybe 2 or 3 reps off. And some of the things that are moderators for that accuracy are you doing more reps in a set? So if you're doing more than 12 reps, you're going to be a little less accurate, which makes sense because you're going to be further from failure when you're making your predictions, right? And you will have accumulated more fatigue. And when you do, let's say, less than 12 reps, like let's say you're doing a 6-rep set, the first rep starts at a 5 RIR. So it's already pretty close to failure. It's like thinking about, if you're in a tunnel and you're trying to predict how close are you to that light at the end of the tunnel, you're like, I don't know, 100 meters? But when you're only 20 meters from it, you can make a much more accurate prediction, right?
Oh, right.
So if there's multiple sets, if it's heavier loads with lower reps, and you did fewer reps to get there, your accuracy is going to be higher. And some data, although it didn't come out in this meta-analysis, would suggest that more trained lifters are better at gauging this. And I think the reason it didn't pop as a significant moderator in the meta-analysis is that being resistance trained doesn't necessarily mean that you are familiarized and you regularly train with RIR, right? Or that you train to failure so that you're very familiar with when you've hit it. And I do think in my anecdotal experience as a lifter and a coach that having experience training to failure is important because this is a skill. Knowing what your limits are is something that you have to push them to know where they are. So without that prior knowledge, it's easy to underestimate RIR, which is what that 0.95 average was. People are slightly underestimating. So I think the real scientific way to look at, okay, should I use percentage 1RM? Should I use RIR or should I use velocity to gauge proximity to failure is which one is going to have the most accuracy. And percentage 1RM, while it's objective, we did a 1RM test and this is a percentage of that, it's actually the least accurate. Like I talked about before, this is a real finding, okay? In a group of college-aged males who can all squat at least 1.5 times body weight, very heterogeneous sample who has squatted at least once a week for 2 years in Dr. Zerdos's lab, we had them go to a 1RM, and then we blinded them to the load. So we put trash bags covering the load. We put 70% of 1RM on the bar, and we had them do as many reps as they could to failure. And we got a range in one of those studies from 9 to 26.
26 reps off from the estimated?
No, they got 26 reps at 70% of 1RM. Like that was their total number of reps.
Damn.
And then, so the mean that was reported is like 16, right? But the range is 9. So some person, the common NSCA textbook, it'll be like, how many repetitions are allowed at 70% of 1RM? Oh, it's 12. And then at 75%, it's 10. So if I want to give someone a challenging but not, maximal workout, I'm going to prescribe 3x10 at 70% of 1RM during a hypertrophy phase. Check. I am an NSCA CPT, right? However, while that might work for the average person, the person who can only do 9 reps at 70% of 1RM will be unable to do that prescription. And the person who can do 15, 20, or 26 reps at 70% of 1RM will be getting almost no stimulus from that workout. It would be like, why don't I just get on the treadmill for 15 minutes? This is not I'm at a 15 RIR, So I think, yes, it's objective, but the individual variability, especially at moderate percentages of 1RM between 70 to 80%, where a lot of bodybuilders train, means that percentage 1RM is not, it's less accurate than RIR. So even if I was off by, let's say I'm less accurate than the average, I'm off by 2 to 3, I'm underestimating. If I'm someone who can do 15, 20 reps and when everyone else could do 8 to 12, it's actually a better decision for me to gauge RIR than for me to use a percentage 1RM. So it depends on the context. But more importantly, this is a skill. And if you go through phases where you train closer to failure with lower volume, and then you train further from failure with higher volume and kind of like a periodized or phasic approach, each one of those times when you're going close to failure, you probably want to choose the right exercises, have a very good spotter, be safe. Those are going to make you better when you then go into those phases and you're trying to stop at, say, a 7 RPE or a 6 or an 8 RPE or what have you. And more importantly, we have research, although there are those limitations I discussed earlier, where sometimes we're comparing volitional failure or momentary muscular failure to a non-failure group that could be, reasonably far or very close to failure. When we look at these 2 meta-analyses, one by Gurgic and colleagues and one by Vieira and colleagues that both came out in 2021, when you equate for volume, the overall finding was non-significant between training to failure and not training to failure. So the people who are like, the last 2 reps are the most important ones in your training session, that's probably not true, you know?
Right.
It is probably important to train reasonably close to failure, as we do have data suggesting being way far from failure is not enough. But you know, while there is variation on this, whether it's volitional or momentary muscular failure, it's not making huge effect size differences from training short of failure. Now, the limitation of that is that most of the research is people training 2 to 3 times per week. So, and I will be honest, like to show that I'm not biased in this, the effect sizes do lean slightly in favor of failure. Like if you were to go, like I want to maximize every single thing. We're looking at like a 0.22, like that's considered a small effect, even though it's non-significant. And there was one sub-analysis in the meta-analysis by Gurjik where they found, if you look just at the trained individuals, there was a significant effect favoring failure. However, that was a mixture of studies that were and weren't equated for volume. So it's still a big question mark, but someone could reasonably take from the literature that, oh, you know what, maybe well-trained lifters should be training closer to failure. And that's something that you hear repeated, like, oh, you got to really push hard once you're well-trained to make those adaptations. You got to force the muscle to grow. But another thing that you see in trained lifters is they're training far more frequently than the studies on trained lifters. So Hackett, did a survey of bodybuilders back in 2013, and the entire cohort was training 5 to 6 days per week. So that's twice the average frequency that you see in resistance training studies. People are training 2 to 3 times per week. So I think the take home when you look at this is that training to failure might be better if you're constraining volume or constraining frequency. Like if you're only going to train 3 days a week, you probably do want to be pretty close to failure most of the time. I mean, more than half the week you're recovering. Like you got 4 days off every week. You're probably okay if you have 48 hours where you need to be recovering because you're not going to be training again. But the same people who might make an argument for training to failure, like in the bodybuilding community, are the same people who are training 5 or 6 days per week, you know?
Right.
And, you know, and like, you know, we have these body part splits and it's like, oh, I'm training, you know, chest and back. And then, you know, so I'll be totally fine for my arm day. It's like, well, you know, let's be honest. Like anytime you're training the upper body, you're hitting, you know, multiple muscle groups indirectly. And, you know, like a leg day, it's still going to have a really long recovery tail. So I think when it comes to trying to do any kind of any type of moderate or high frequency or moderate or high volume approach, you almost are forced to start controlling failure to some degree if you want to get what is potentially optimal. It doesn't mean you need to be training at a 5 RIR, but typically the way I set up training is I think about how do I maximize performance in this session and how do I make sure I'm not hurting performance in subsequent sessions, right? So if I'm not going to do any more than say like 6 to 8 sets per muscle group per session, again, to maximize performance, because if I was to do like 12 sets of chest in a single workout, by the time I get to that 3rd or 4th exercise, it's pretty much trash volume, right? I'm dumping load, I'm dumping reps, I'm basically just getting really, really sore. So, okay, that means if I want to get to, let's say, 12 sets per week, I'm going to train my chest twice per week. So I need to make sure that the session I do today, this exercise doesn't hinder the performance on the next one too much, and I need to be recovered in 48 to 72 hours when I do my next chest exercises.
Right.
So what that might look like is, okay, I'm going to start out with bench or flat dumbbells, and I'll train between like a 7 to 9 RPE for my first exercise, and then I'll finish with like, say, a fly or something like that, an isolation movement or another press, and then I'll train to like an 8 to 10 RPE and maybe hit failure close to the last set of the day so it doesn't hurt the other sets. And then there's a little bit of failure in that workout, but it shouldn't be so much that I won't be ready again in 72 hours, and then I'll follow that same pattern. So it's trying to get like the most intensity you can without hurting the intensity of subsequent sessions, basically. And that's why it is theoretically important for bodybuilders to consider this, not just powerlifters, you know, as essentially you're trying to get the most aggregate stress out of your program, not just make today look really awesome for your YouTube channel, you know.
To get the likes, man, to get the sponsorships.
That's right.
So it's right. So it's basically a tool, let's say it like that, for long-term exposure to sufficient tension, right? Can we think about it like that? Not like an excuse to not train hard enough, like some people still think to this day.
Absolutely. And I would say that the way RPE is used, especially among strength athletes, is sometimes to allow you to exceed what your expectations are if you're feeling good. So it's not only just to constrain your performance, because there's a number of ways to program this. So for example, you might say, hey, I'm just going to choose a load, like 80% of 1RM, and then I'm just going to do as many reps as I want and then stop once I hit a 2 RIR. That's one way to do it, and then the load is fixed. But that allows you to potentially do more reps than you might expect if you're feeling great and you're fatiguing slowly, or you're stronger and that 80% is actually like 75% today because you're just stronger than normal. Or if you're feeling terrible, it might limit the number of reps, which probably was what you need if you're feeling terrible, to constrain the total amount of fatigue you're generating. Another way to do RPE-based prescription is to say, I'm going to come in and I'm going to do 3 sets of 5 at a 7 RPE, right? And maybe your old program was 3 sets of 5 at 80% of 1RM, and those are supposed to be like equivalent, right? Well, if you do 3 sets of 5 at 80% of 1RM, it doesn't matter how you feel. You're putting 80% on the bar of whatever you did in your 1RM test from a few weeks ago. But if you do 3 by 5 at 7 RPE, if you're warming up and the bar speed's moving quickly and you're feeling really good and you want to put on 85% of 1RM, you can, so long as you think that that'll probably be close to a 7 RPE. And if you're off by a little bit, oh, that was actually an 8, then you just reduce the load on your next set. But it actually gives you the opportunity to push harder than you otherwise would if you had a fixed program, as well as potentially constrain things if you're feeling under-recovered. So I think some of the criticisms are very one-sided. Like if I do acknowledge that RPE allows you to train easier, but also it'll allow you to train harder when you're in a position to be able to do so if you take that opportunity, which any serious athlete should. And it's actually why I like it, not because it protects me from just going to failure all the time.
Right. And actually, on the very same subject of outdoor regulation, just one last topic, be as always respectful of your time. Can we briefly discuss the 22 meta-analysis by Hickman, which you already discussed in the volume 6, issue 3, and also on your podcast? But I find it really interesting because I know RPE and RIR are close and dear to your heart. And it was kind of a hit that there was no significant difference between all the regulation tools.
Yeah, man. P equals 0.06. It's just stopping right short of the line. It's just a dagger in my heart, right? So yeah, I think we really need to acknowledge that, kind of like I described before, RIR and RPE can enhance the precision of your programming, but it's not fundamentally changing a program, So the meta-analysis by Hickman, just to really high-level review it, it looked at 1RM strength improvements and comparing percentage 1RM compared to auto-regulation either by velocity or by RPE. And the overall effect size was small but non-significant in favor of auto-regulation. And it was more clear when you compared RPE versus percentage 1RM than it was velocity versus percentage 1RM. But that was almost certainly just because the velocity-based studies were shorter in length. So any kind of effect takes more time to manifest, while all of the RPE-based studies, and there's only 3 of them, are 8 weeks or longer. And they also did some comparisons of different velocity loss thresholds, which they call that volume autoregulation, but it's autoregulating both the total number of reps per set and proximity to failure. So I think we can just kind of park that discussion if we want to just keep it to RIR and RPE. But overall, they found that, at best, this is going to have a small, close to significant impact, autoregulation of load on strength. And the reason being is that it's not like you're not lifting heavy when you're not using RPE or RIR. It's just that it may be slightly less accurate. The RIR might have more variation in the group that is using a percentage of 1RM. But so long as it is progressive and sufficiently heavy, you're going to get big picture same outcomes. Because these studies are matching for frequency, they're matching for exercise selection, they're matching for volume. So the differences in load are going to be slight. And I think we can only expect so much. And the promise of auto-regulation, the intended promise in my head, like what I want to get out of it, is a way to individualize training. And we know that if we can successfully individualize training, which we only know retrospectively, like we put people on a bunch of different programs and we see which ones they responded better to. Sometimes you can see someone making 2 to 3-fold gains on one program versus another, right? That was shown recently in a study by DeMoss, where they were comparing moderate to low volume, 2 to 3 times per week versus high volume 5 times a week. And they did it in a within subject design. So one leg did that versus the other person's leg did the higher volume one. And you got to see some people literally had one leg that responded 2 to 3 times better to a lower volume versus higher volume approach, or vice versa to a higher volume versus lower volume. But they weren't able to predict beforehand which one you'd respond better to. So yes, we know that individuals need individualized approaches. And sometimes that can be a huge game changer. Like I said, if you made 2 to 3 times the gains on your non-individualized program versus what you might respond better to, you would experience that as finding the holy grail for your style of training, and that matches my anecdotal experience of when I finally figured out that I need way more volume on upper body. All of a sudden, my upper body started growing after years of plateaus. So right. That's real. But I wasn't able just to go, you know what, I'm going to use RPE and that'll happen, right? That doesn't tell me, like, just because I'm accurate at gauging an 8 RPE doesn't mean that I know I should be training to an 8 RPE, or that I should be doing 3 sets of 8 at 8 RPE. Maybe I should be doing 8 sets of 3, or 4x5, or training 3 sets of 8, but every 3 days instead of every 4 days. So there's no way for us yet to predict what is the best individualized program for you. So RPE is basically a way of enhancing the precision of your program, but you can have a very precise, shitty program, which is the issue, right? Like, I can have someone learn how to use RPE and program with it, and they can write a terrible program, but they've used RPE. And the people will precisely choose the right load in their terrible program, but that's not enough to make that terrible program a good program. Totally. Likewise, a really good program that is quite appropriate for someone that uses percentage of 1RM, it might get their intended stress per set a little higher or a little lower than intended on some days. Like, oh, I thought you were going to be 2 reps from failure, but you're only 1, or you were 3. But that's not going to be like a huge game changer as far as the overall effectiveness of the program.
Very well. So if you have the time, could you give us some brief takeaways on the implementation of RIR? Maybe how far can we go from failure, from what we know up until this point to maximize hypertrophy?
Absolutely. Yeah. If we kind of look at the velocity loss threshold studies, which are, like I said, they're a little tangential. They're probably the best indication we have of how far from failure can we be. And the way this works is you take the velocity of the first rep in a set, and then you look at how much did velocity slow down as you progress through the set. So let's say, for example, I picked up, 75% of 1RM, okay? And that first rep went at 0.48 meters per second. And I said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to use a 25% velocity loss threshold. So once the velocity slows down to the point where it's only going 3/4 as fast as that first fastest rep, that's when we would stop the set. So we would stop at a 0.36 meters per second, right? As an example. And that would probably be equivalent to performing with a 25% velocity loss, like maybe half to 2/3 of the possible reps I can get in that set. And if that was 75% of 1RM, that's like doing, 6 reps at 75% of 1RM. And that seems to produce very similar outcomes to like 40 or 50% of 1RM. Sorry, 40 or 50% velocity loss thresholds, right, that are taking you really close to failure. So in that HICMOT meta-analysis, there was significant differences between higher than 25% velocity losses and lower. But once you started to compare like right around 25% or 20 to 25% versus higher, the differences became non-significant. They just slightly favored going higher. So if we kind of convert these into RIRs, what we're basically talking about is that right around like a 5 to 7 RPE or like a 3 to 5 RIR is when you start to get almost equivalent to being closer to failure, right? The differences really start to narrow. And that's important to note that, again, they're also doing more reps at the same load in these velocity loss threshold studies. So this isn't quite equivalent to saying, hey, you're going to do a set of 10 and I'm going to do a set of 10, but you're going to choose a load that will have you stop at a 7 RPE, and I'm going to choose a load where I go to failure, right? That would actually be even closer. With velocity loss thresholds, we use the same load, and I just do less reps and stop further from failure. So velocity loss thresholds are looking at the combined effect of lower set volume and being further from failure, and they still don't find a big difference. So I think it kind of tells us that there's a valid reason to be training anywhere from a 5 to 10 RPE, leaving anywhere from 0 to 5 RIR in the tank. And those sets probably count to some degree. And then you have to think about, okay, well, why would I train at like a 5 or a 6 RPE? Like, what's the purpose of that, Eric? I don't understand. I don't need to be that far from failure. And you don't need to be that far from failure unless you need to be that far from failure. And then you're like, what the hell are you saying? Well, I'm saying that what you might want to do is progress throughout a block, or you might want to have a block where you're trying to enhance volume. Like, your primary variable that you want to increase is set volume. Let's say you're taking like a Mike Israetel approach, right? Sure. So where you're trying to progress sets on a week-to-week basis, and you might be getting up to the point where you're doing 20 sets per muscle group. It might behoove you, since you're going to get a lot of cumulative fatigue as you do each one of those successive sets, to start at a lower RPE, like 5 or 6, knowing that 4 sets from now, you might be around an 8 or a 9 RPE because of that cumulative fatigue. And that if you tried to start that mesocycle, let's say on week 1 out of 6, at an 8 RPE, that you might not be able to complete those 20 sets and recover from it. And it would just be a poor approach, and you'd be better off just staying in a lower volume range. So I think the lower RPEs are useful when you're doing, for one, higher volume approaches, higher frequency approaches, early on in the block when you're trying to build quote unquote momentum. And then additionally, when you're using those exercises which recruit a lot of muscle at once, and you're trying to avoid like a huge cardiometabolic demand that's going to create kind of like global fatigue that might trigger central fatigue and just delay the effectiveness of your workout.
Very well. So I think that covers it, man. I'm going to have a really tough time summarizing this because I usually do a post in Spanish about all the important points, but man, it's been really packed with important points. So that's a good thing. So
well,
I cannot
it'll
thank
be
you
even harder
enough.
for me to summarize in Spanish, so I'm glad you're doing it. So
Don't worry, man. Don't worry. Just cut me off some of that 10% gains. Can you leave it at 5%?
I'll get you an affiliate code for the gains. Yeah.
Oh man, that sounds pretty sweet. So anyway, I don't want to take any more of your time. As always, I cannot thank you enough, man, for taking the time. I learned a lot of things. I'm sure all the people joining us also learn a lot, and it's a huge learning opportunity. So thanks again, man. I hope we can have you sometime soon in Mexico.
I'd love to. Yeah, man. It'd be an honor and a pleasure. And thanks for having me on. And I will see you next time, buddy. All right, man.
Sure, man. Have a great day. Thank you, Eric.
You too. Take care, Daniel.